Hi, welcome to Pop Goes the Culture. Thanks for calling in. While you're waiting to be brought on the air, set up your computer or your phone or tablet properly to get the best possible picture and sound. We want you to look your best. You're going to be on TV. First, find a quiet spot with not a lot of noise, preferably away from the kids, pets, and traffic. If you have a headset, that will give you the best sound. If you're on your computer camera, don't lean in. Sit back and relax so that you're framed the same way you see people on TV, head and shoulders. You might even want to raise your computer up so that it's level with your face. Put it on a box or a book and make sure it's stable. If you're using a cell phone, see if you can get a simple cell phone tripod. They're easy to set up. If you don't have a tripod, no worries. Set the camera for selfies. Hold the phone about arm's distance from your face. Make sure it's landscape or horizontal, not portrait or vertical. Try to keep the camera level, not too high, not too low. Make sure you can see your whole face and maybe shoulders in the frame. Next, find a nice light in front of you. Never sit in front of a bright window or light source. Turn around until you find the best light and background and the shot is looking attractive. This is a good shot. This one, not so much. Don't put your head too high or too low in the shot. Your eyes should be about 1/3 down from the top of the frame. Okay, now you're looking and sounding your best, and you're ready for your close-up. Keep watching, and maybe we'll be bringing you on the show soon.
Tonight on Pop Goes the Culture, a very special episode of Ask Them Yourself. He toiled in near obscurity for the early part of his career. That is until he teamed up with artists like Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, John Romita, Gene Colan, and others to usher in the Marvel Age of comics, introducing a pantheon of iconic characters like Spider-Man, the Hulk, the Fantastic Four, Iron Man, Thor, Doctor Strange, the X-Men, and the Avengers, while pioneering the concept of a unified fictional world in which all those characters could meet and interact. And that made him a fan favorite at conventions and college campuses all over the country. Today, that cast of characters is recognized throughout the world from TV, interactive games, and on the big screen, of course, in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Through his cameo appearances in those movies, he was introduced to an even larger audience, becoming as famous a creator as Walt Disney himself, and now he's universally acclaimed as the father of the Marvel Universe. Now, colleagues, friends, and fans are here to share their memories, and you can be part of the conversation too by logging in at AskThemYourself.com. Tonight, we're remembering Stan Lee. And welcome to a very special episode of Ask Them Yourself. Tonight, we have a number of guests. We're doing things a little bit differently than we normally do, but you can still call in. We are having on today some very special guests. Some we announced, some we did not announce, some were a surprise. A couple that we weren't able to bring on as promised, but mostly it's going to be a good night tonight. When I was growing up, Stan Lee was perhaps, he was kind of a big influence on me, as he was on many people. Stan was, of course, the father of Marvel Comics. Now, there were probably a lot of people who say, well, there were a lot of fathers of Marvel Comics. Certainly, there was Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko. But Stan was the guy who sort of took these all and put them together into one place and kind of made them the community that Marvel became for people. So tonight we are taking your phone calls. Go to www.askthemyourself.com and you can call in and participate. But tonight is about Stan, and tonight is about Stan's fans, which hopefully you are, if you love the kinds of stuff that Stan did at Marvel Comics as I did. You may have gotten to meet him at Comic-Cons. He was I would call him probably the most accessible icon in the history of icons. He was always there, always willing to talk to people, always willing to say hello to people. And I met him early. I met him many times. I got to interview him a few times. I actually was in his office once, back when he was still in New York City. Anyway, we have a number of great guests for you tonight, and I don't want to wait a single moment. So we are going to bring on our first guest. So let's do it. And joining me now is Larry Lieberman, who in the early 2000s was the chief marketing officer for Virgin Comics. And Larry, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
My pleasure. So Larry, let's talk. You worked a little bit with Stan Lee. It almost came from out of nowhere. Talk about what you were doing, where you were doing it, what Virgin Comics was, and how you happened to meet Stan.
It's funny words you just used, that working with Stan Lee comes out of nowhere. It seems like all of us have a relationship with Stan that came out of nowhere. It came out of our initial casual relationships with these incredible stories we all read as young people. And none of us, I don't think, at the time knew that these stories would have value for all of us decades later.
Right.
That we still remember every episode of a Spider-Man cartoon, or each individual book in a Fantastic Four series, or even that we'd be rereading them as adults.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's the amazing part. So Virgin Comics was an amazing opportunity. The founder, Sharad Devarajan, is just a creative genius, and there's, it was very clear that Stan Lee had changed his life as a child, and
even in India. He was from India, correct?
He's actually from New Jersey, of all places, but his family is of Indian heritage. Mm-hmm. He has spent most of his life living back in India, and his dream was to create superheroes and stories from the East, out of Indian heritage, that could be as powerful within that culture and the whole world stage. And he made it come true, right? It was a remarkable scenario. I mean, this is what Sharad and his partner Gautam Chopra still do. They have a remarkable company that it's called Graphics India, and they create stories largely influenced by Indian culture.
Interesting.
And it was back in 2007 that I first met Stan in the context of Virgin Comics, and it was at a Comic-Con, right, which is an incredibly intimidating place to meet Stan. It's like meeting Elvis, right, at a rock concert. He's the one. Oh, and of course, it was before Iron Man, the film, had even come out. So we're in a room, Sharad and I, with Robert Downey Jr., right? Who is about to reinvent one of the greatest characters of our lives. And we start talking to Stan about this idea of bringing his level of storytelling and his mindset to an Eastern audience and Eastern context. Mm-hmm. And a year later, at Comic-Con in New York in 2008, we introduced Stan, and he did an entire panel of what his vision was for combining his storytelling and his structure with, in fact, the inspiration and powers of India.
That's amazing. So, did you guys work together? What started to happen?
We did start to work together. It was great fun. Ultimately, the end product was a series on Cartoon Network in India called Chakra, and Chakra the Incredible. And chakras are the powers within each one of us, based on Indian health and storytelling. And this superhero used his powers within to really, solve problems and make the world a better place. Where the magic of, the magic of Stan Lee is from the very first time I met him. He looked us in the eye and he said, "The superpowers don't matter. it's the characters.
Interesting.
And it just silenced the room because he didn't care whether the character zapped webs from his arms or like Thing was a giant. It just didn't matter because it was how the character's core and personality and mission combined with those powers
Interesting,
to tell
Larry.
a story.
Interesting.
Right? And it wasn't for years later when I sat with Stan that you realize that what Stan was describing was himself.
Interesting.
Right? Because you knew when you worked with Stan that what he was saying to you is, if you don't understand me, then it doesn't matter how great my stories are.
Hmm.
And that was great.
That's very cool. That's very cool.
So it was great fun. And talk about a man who was just simple and fun to deal with and always on and accessible. And for whom, really, it was like being with Elvis. Every single person who ever met Stan in my presence had a story to tell Stan about one of the characters, scenarios, scenes, storyline that had changed that person's perspective on life. Who gets to do that?
Yeah. Well, he was probably, there are certain people who are icons in our pop culture history. Walt Disney comes to mind. There are a few others who come to mind. But Stan was the most accessible. Stan was the icon that so many people either got to meet or felt that they knew because of his soapbox or because you could write a letter and he would write back when, he was accessible. Probably the most accessible icon in history, certainly in the 20th century. 21st, early 21st.
And made a point of it and somehow kept it going. When Stan was 85 years old, I watched him walk the line at New York Comic Con. And, for those who don't have a context for this, it's essentially the world's longest bank line, right? It's the world's longest supermarket line. It's just the world's longest line.
Yeah.
Thousands of people line up hours in advance, be it a sunny day, a rainy day, a snowy day, to get into Comic-Con and immerse themselves in the wonderful experience that these festivals are. Stan went out and walked the entire line,
outside,
shaking people's hands. It was actually in a quasi indoor outdoor area. It's like in a loading dock area.
Oh yeah.
Jacob Javits Convention Center in New York. So it wasn't warm, but it wasn't being rained on.
Right.
But these people had been there for hours waiting to get in. And the idea just came up. He's like, wait, the doors aren't open yet? And people are waiting, says Stan. Oh, let's go out and say hello. And
that's
he did.
Amazing. That is amazing.
Yeah.
Wow.
And, for the people he met that day, the greatest moment at this festival and event that they were looking forward to happened in the hallway before the place ever opened.
Larry, I you know that I've met literally hundreds of stars and celebrities and iconic figures. I've had two out-of-body experiences in my life. One was Norman Lear, and the other was Stan Lee. When Stan Lee walked into the room where I was going to be interviewing him, and I had met him before, but he walked in and it was like, oh my God, I'm going to sit down and talk with Stan for an hour and just ask him whatever I want and talk about it. And he was just so, there are people have varying opinions on him, as you go through lots of obituaries, and people say good, bad, and indifferent. I liked him. He was a great guy. Final thoughts on Stan before we
I'd like all of us to not just remember Stan the showman, because no one had more personality than Stan, but let's all remember Stan the scholar. And you can actually verify that, right? You spent an hour peppering Stan with questions that about anything and everything, and he had a response that was relevant for everyone.
Yeah.
He was that scholarly in his trade. It is no accident. He's the greatest there ever was.
Larry Lieberman, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Although, now that I think about it, Stan also had the world's worst memory and it was well known. I am bringing on another guest now. This is Steve Van Patten, who is an author and also a fellow Marvel fan and Stan Lee fan. Hi, welcome to the show, Steve. Can you hear me? I guess you can't hear me. All right. Well, I'm gonna take a moment. You can't hear me right now. I'll take that as a no. All right. We're gonna move on to our next guest. So give me just a second, and we're gonna go to this. Actually, before we do that, what I want to do is thank some of our fans. Now, if you don't know, patreon.com is where you can go to sort of help us, and you can jump to the top of the line to be on our show. And I promise to thank our Patreon fans. So I'm going to thank them now. So first of all, I'd like to thank, and if I get your name wrong, please let me know, and I apologize. I'm going to thank Amanda Hoffman, Amanda Sabin, Ashley Hammett Patterson, Cameron Atwood, Carl Bishop, Carol Frank, Deanna Barker, Aaron Kirby, Katie Alyssa, Kendra Fardella, Kimberly Nichols, Lillian Horowitz, Melissa Cutler, Rachel, Seth, Sherry Bond, Shiloh, Ogie Bean, I hope I pronounced your name right, Shiloh, Tim Stepich, and Trevor. So thank you very, very much for contributing to our show. Joining me now is Ari Kaplan, who is a writer and a comic book writer, author, scholar, comic book historian. Ari, thanks for joining us today.
Great to be here, David.
So, Stan Lee, the man himself.
Yeah.
Tell me your thoughts as we look back on Stan's life. What do you think?
Well, I interviewed Stan. I first met him when I interviewed him for a series of magazine articles I wrote in a magazine called Reform Judaism Magazine, a very on-the-nose title. Right. And it was a series of articles about the history of Jews in the comic book industry, and it directly led to my first two book deals, the second of which was From Krakow to Krypton, Jews in Comic Books.
Right.
I interviewed Stan for those two books as well. So I got to know him a little bit. My impression of him certainly, it's weird because there's certain things that everyone says about his contributions to comic book writing in general and the Marvel universe in the 60s in particular. And I think what gets left out of the conversation a lot of the time, what people do say is that his characters had feet of clay, which is true. But I think that is kind of highlighted too much at the expense of a lot of the other things that he brought to the table. For example, I think he was really good at character development. He had a really good way of making these characters very grounded and relatable. Right. And I think that should be mentioned. Also, his dialogue for its time was very, comparatively realistic. It's weird to say about these comics because a lot of them were written, largely for kids and teenagers in the 1960s. So by today's standards, the dialogue isn't that realistic. But compared to most of the other stuff that was going on in comic book writing, a lot of the other scripts that were being written at that point, his scripts were relatively very realistic in terms of dialogue.
They were naturalistic. There was a sense of go ahead.
Yeah, no, definitely true. And it's weird because my daughter, who's 8 years old, she and I sometimes read the old Stan Lee and Jack Kirby comics together. Mm-hmm. And what's funny is you get to see, she's reading them for the first time. I am not. Right. And but you get to see the emotional resonance that they still have, and the punch that they all pack. Like we were reading the story where Captain America, he's thawed out of the, he's brought out of the ice, he's brought out of suspended animation. Mm-hmm. He's been in suspended animation for 20 years. The Avengers thaw him out, And oh my God, it's Captain America, and he's unconscious.
Right.
And then when he wakes up, there's this great scene where he sits bolt upright, and he's like, oh my God, Bucky, no. And, and of course, what's great about it is he's waking up at the exact moment after he went under. I mean, in his head, it's the exact moment after he went under.
Right, seconds have passed.
As far as he knows, Bucky sacrificing his life happened like a second ago. And what's great about that scene is it still works, like dramatically, even to me as a reader, as an audience member. Mm-hmm. And it's not the first time I've read that story by far, but it's still it's so dark, mm-hmm. and it's so dramatic. It just grips you in a great kind of way. And, Stan and Jack were Marvel style. Both of them plotted this story, and Stan writing the dialogue and Jack providing the visuals, and sort of kind of taking Stan's plot and breaking it down panel by panel. And the two of them together, I think, brought so much drama to the table. It really works dramatically. It just... Yeah, the story is dated in certain ways, but in terms of the drama, it still really, really connects with the reader. And I think that should be said also.
Well, there's a level of the fact that, when the story was updated for the movies, which it was, obviously, they brought... It's essentially the same story. I mean, the dialogue has changed mm-hmm. a little bit, but the story itself, the pathos and the drama of it.
That's what I mean. When you read that story and you read that scene specifically, and you're like, oh my God, this poor guy, he thinks this just happened, and he thinks that his partner, his sidekick, is still alive, that this kid is still alive. And it's just gonna ruin him when it's not, when he realizes what he's been under for 20 years. And then, when he has to walk around outside, he doesn't recognize the fashions or, the hairstyles or anything. Everything's different. It's been 20 years. It's just great. And I think Stan had an knack for sort of getting that dramatic hook in every story. How can we tease out the drama? How can we get the relationships to really click and really work and have a lot of naturalistic conflict in them? And I think that's a large part of what he brought to these stories as well.
Now, you interviewed him a couple of times. What were your impressions of him as a person hanging out with him?
It was a lot of fun. My impressions of him as a person, gosh, there's a lot of time to unpack there. He was very clever. He was very creative. He was very funny. You got the sense, definitely. I mean, it's weird because if I was him, I wouldn't know what to make all this. Consider you're him and you're Stan Lee, and you spent, from roughly around 1940 to 1961, relative anonymity working at this comic book company that wasn't the biggest company in the world at the time, and we definitely couldn't compete with DC at that time in terms of sales figures. And all of a sudden in the mid-'60s, after the first few years of what we now know as the Marvel Universe, people really started paying attention to your work and your these characters you co-created and this shared universe you co-created in a big way. College campuses are paying attention to it. They're reading it on college campuses. Readers who are older than your target audience are reading it. The Village Voice and Rolling Stone is doing articles on you. And then all of a sudden, and it just gets better from there. You definitely get this. I definitely got the sense talking to him that, I mean, he'd had decades to ingest this by the time I'd spoken to him.
Right.
We did a lot of our interviews in the mid 2000s, but that he definitely had a more grounded attitude towards it than I think we give him. Mm-hmm. I think we think of him as this bombastic showman and this someone who was really brilliant in marketing and branding, and he was, even before they called it branding. Mm-hmm. And I think he is one of the people who's largely responsible for making Marvel this big shared universe in this interesting kind of way that owes a lot to sort of fantasy novels and television and radio shows and the way they kind of created these interconnected episodes that left you really wanting the next chapter in the story. But he had a sense of humor about it, I think. I think he had a sense he knew what his role was in terms of all this stuff. and yet I think he certainly had a sense of humor about it. I think he certainly knew that as much as people were crediting him for all this stuff, and as much as he deserved the credit, that, you know, he realized there were other people who accompanied him on this journey and who also, you know, deserved a lot of the credit as well. So I got the sense that he certainly, he knew that he was just one person in a team,
right.
You know?
Right. Interesting. Any final thoughts before we move on, Ari? Thank you for joining us today.
Oh yeah, sure. Just a couple of things very briefly. I mean, it was weird. When my first book came out, I got a handwritten note from him. I got in the mail.
Right.
My first book was called Masters of the Comic Book Universe Revealed. It was profiles of 11 different comic book creators, and he was one of them. Right. And I hadn't told him. I guess he was aware of the publication date because I had told him that way before this. But I hadn't expected a letter. I hadn't written him a letter in the mail and snail mail. But I got this really nice handwritten note. It was like a Spider-Man's head, right. Stationery, and then with like a handwritten word balloon coming out of it saying, "Hope you have a bestseller. Love, Stan." Wow. And it was just so sweet, and I've heard similar stories certainly in the past few weeks since he passed away from a lot of other people, just of him like going above and beyond, being very nice and very supportive. I know that it was interesting because at the time I interviewed him for the magazine series, I hadn't written a book yet. I hadn't done a lot of the things I'd done since then. And I hadn't started working in the comic book industry professionally at that point yet. But I know that the reason he took me seriously was because I wrote for Mad Magazine, and he knew he'd written stories with Harvey Kurtzman, the creator of Mad. He'd worked with Al Jaffe. Clearly. I think Al may have been the person that connected the two of us in the first place, I think. Either Al or it was Will Eisner who connected Stan and I. But you got the sense that they were like this sort of like almost like a secret society, these people who came up together. Right. And like almost like they were in the war together or something. And they kind of had this mutual respect for one another. And so if you were in any way connected to that, he had respect for you, and so I think that's why he liked the fact that I wrote for Mad. And I think he was quite a good comedy writer himself, also. Yeah, so I think
there was so much comedy in his work overall, and it's just pretty amazing to see the whole thing occur. Ari Kaplan, thank you for joining us today to remember Stan Lee.
Thank you very much, David.
I appreciate it. Wow, that's pretty amazing to see his work. We are going to try to bring once again Steve Van Patten on. Steve, are you there?
Yes.
Good. Hold on.
Buddy.
How are you?
I'm good.
What's happening?
Nice Monday night.
It is a nice Monday night.
Yeah, just got plugged in real quick. Just running in from work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Stan.
Yeah, I got to tell you this.
We didn't expect he would ever die, did we?
I guess not. I guess we never. I for one never put any. And I mean, you and I, we both work on the same thing, so
right.
It's like we juggle celebrity death all the time,
Not
but
like this.
This one, no, this was too close to home. I mean, we're talking about somebody who basically had their hooks in me since I was 4.
Yeah,
you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
so it's it's crazy. It's like I really felt bad. I like old black woman at a funeral bed. Like, oh God, Jesus. I was bad. I was like, wow. That took me. And people know me, so they called. Are you all right? Like, well, I'm sad as hell, but it is what it is. He lived a great, prolific. God willing, all of us
we should all
get to be as prolific as this man was. I mean, it's just crazy though, because now it's one of those things that really makes you face your own mortality in a way. It's like, oh wow, so if he's gone, then that means hell. But here we are. We shall persevere in his good name.
He was pretty. You wrote a really nice piece on him, I think, on Facebook. Can you just kind of sum it up a little bit for us, because it was nicely written. You should be a writer.
Oh yeah. Well, the crux of it was because it was near Thanksgiving, and I don't, with everything being the way it is these days, if I'm on Facebook, it's usually to say something quick and dirty and jump off now because things have become so inflammatory. Let's use that word. So, I had maybe a shot of tequila in me, and it was like the eve before Thanksgiving, and I kind of vented a little bit, and then basically what it was is I was explaining how Stan Lee's work affected my life as a child. It made it better. It helped ground me in the sense of just knowing right from wrong, So, that was basically, and I was basically saying that, I was thankful for his work, his lessons within the work, and all of that.
Right. Well, with great power comes great responsibility, right?
Yes, sir.
So, over time, now you've worked in the TV industry, and I know that to make your living, you don't just write, but you write, and that's what you aspired to. How much did Stan's influence impact your wish to become a writer, and a writer of fantasy for that matter?
Well, he definitely is a blueprint to follow, just in terms of the themes and character development within the Marvel universe. It has matured with the reader, because Spider-Man goes from being a picked on kid to like this guy hangs out with Tony Stark and marries a soap opera actress, and if you get to a certain age, you get to follow that and all of these other iconic characters that are just now a part of the mythos. And for me, just as somebody who grew up with it, not just somebody who discovered it just because it's fancy and cool and it's in movies now. I mean, the whole world that he and the other people in the team, Steve Ditko, obviously, Jack Kirby and all those folks. I mean, from a writer's standpoint, it's literally, you're literally standing on the shoulder of giants, in that regard. So it really, like, losing him, was really palatable. Like I remember being upset at celebrity deaths before, but like this was because, like I said, this was like Stan Lee and Excelsior and and the little answering I heard somebody else mention how he would answer some of the letters and stuff. Like I had a letter answered. I never actually got to meet him, but there was some comment I made about Morbius a million years ago that I got an answer, and it was like, oh my God, and it was like, and I think I was an adult when that happened, actually, so it was kind of funny. But yeah, he was it. He was our giant,
Yeah, I was fortunate to meet him multiple times. I got to interview him twice for MTV.
Mm-hmm.
Just as I'll never forget, I was sitting in my office and the phone rings. I pick it up and I go, David Levin. And he goes, David Levin, it's Stan Lee. And I'm like, and then the next question was, why am I calling you? Because somebody had called him and reached out to him to book him for, we were doing this. We had done the Spider-Man special, and we had done, and now we were going to be doing the Hulk special. This is the Sam Raimi film, and then the Ang Lee film.
Right.
And so I wanted to interview him. Of course, I wanted to interview him, and I had done the interview with him for the Spider-Man special, which was lots of fun. Had a total one of the few out-of-body experiences of my life when he walked in, even though I had met him before.
Sure.
And then for the Hulk special, when I reintroduced myself, because he famously has a terrible memory, I mentioned that I had done the Spider-Man special for MTV. And both he and Avi Arad said, who had produced the Spider-Man movies, and Avi was still producing for Marvel at that point.
Right.
both said to me that they loved the Spider-Man special, which was very nice to hear, and they both said that it was the best special of all the specials. Now, I know he was just being kind, but to get that kind of approbation from Stan Lee was just,
that's life affirming, man.
Out of body. Yeah, I could. Okay, you can take me now because that's
right.
all. That's all I need.
Take me, Jesus. I'm done.
So, by the way, everybody, happy Hanukkah. Take me, Jesus, but happy Hanukkah tonight.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Hey, happy Hanukkah.
All good. Yes, thank you. So we're going to go on to a couple of more interviews. You want to hang out for a little while?
Yeah, I'll stick around.
Okay, good. Okay, so our next interview is coming up, and this one was kind of a surprise that we got to do this one. Joining me now is Lloyd Kaufman, who knows a thing or two about creating universes. Lloyd created the Tromaverse, and also a superhero or two, including the Toxic Avenger. And Lloyd, today we're talking about the great Stan Lee. Obviously, you met him. I guess you've known him for a while. What are your thoughts on the passing of Stan?
I went to Yale University. Other than drugs, the only thing I took away was Marvel comics. I didn't read comic books as a child. I wasn't permitted. And I went to Yale. The guy next door had this collection of Marvel comics, 1965, 66. I couldn't. They knocked me out. And as soon as I graduated, and I searched out Stan Lee, and I was headed toward making underground movies anyway.
Right.
So I think he saw on my resume. I got to him because he wasn't Stan Lee in those days. He was working. He was Stan Lee, but he wasn't really Stan Lee. He was still at Magazine Management, which eventually became Marvel or whatever. And he lived not far from where I live, and in New York City. But he gave me he saw my resume, probably Yale, and he probably figured, well, he can't be too retarded. So we met a couple of times and hit it off, and he gave me a reel-to-reel tape on which he had recorded some ideas for a movie called Night of the Witch.
Interesting.
I wrote the script, and I made the witch only kill bad people. They only killed bad people. The witch had this problem where it was only bad, and you didn't know who the witch was.
Mm-hmm.
So we got it optioned to a shitty little company called Canon, where I was working. I was working cleaning toilets or whatever.
I remember Canon. Yes.
With Canon, where I met John G. Avildsen, who eventually did Joe, on which I worked. Mm-hmm. But so that was the first thing with Stan, was we got a script option right out of the box.
That's amazing.
Even before he was the famous Stan Lee. Mm-hmm. And he had done Spider. I mean, obviously, I had tracked him down because of Spider-Man and the Hulk and all that stuff. And the comic books just opened my brain. And the Troma universe, as it evolved, was very much inspired by Stan's universe, by the Marvel universe, and except that we've been in the underground. And whenever I would get together with Stan, probably I'm the longest running friend of Stan Lee who's still alive, I would guess. I can't imagine anybody who's alive known him longer than I. But he would always tell me that I should be more mainstream. That was a big problem. Of the Troma movies, he loved Sergeant Kabuki Man, NYPD, the most. Maybe a year later, Jim Carrey did or something.
Interesting. So introduce me to your lovely wife behind you, Pat. Say hello, Pat.
Actually, Pat's the only reason Stan Lee stayed friends with me. Every time we'd all get together with Joan, mm-hmm. He made it clear that I can't wear his Pat.
Here I am.
Yeah,
there you are.
Well, now where did you go?
So Troma is known for its amazing movies, and your camera work is just a great example of the quality that you can see in any Troma movie.
Yeah, well, it's the Blue Apron. Our son-in-law created Blue Apron, and we do Blue Apron trophy wife chapters whenever she cooks Blue Apron, and I put them on my Instagram.
We lost you. You froze a little bit.
Got a big following on my Instagram, I would say. Not as much as Charlotte Stokely, but almost.
What are you doing now, Lloyd? You told me you were going to Poland tomorrow? Is that
Troma Tribute, doing a master class. They're showing our latest film, Return to Nucleami, aka Volume 2, which I think there's something wrong with my phone. But and I apologize for the bad reception. But
the reception's not bad. I'm going to buy you a tripod for Hanukkah. There we go. This is live TV, folks.
Something wrong with the phone. At any rate, there's the wife. Look how clean she is. She's washing. She even washes up there. So clean. At any rate, you can't see anything.
Well, we're going to bring. I would like to bring you on for a full hour sometime and let people call and ask you questions. Would you like to do that sometime?
Yeah, you bet. Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
Final thoughts on Stan before we go.
Well, Stan Lee, Troma is 44 years old, and there is no question that Stan Lee is a huge influence on the Tromaverse, because that's what we've done. We've created a Troma universe, part Stan Lee and part Andy Warhol's factory. Our superstars are 500-pound action heroes and the Toxic Avenger and weird, mutants and whatever, but they're underground. They're very graphic and lots of beautiful young men and women having intense sexual relations but inspired by the Marvel universe and Andy Warhol. But Stan Lee was a guiding force for my whole career, and was in fact we did I had an idea for a superhero that was going to be more mainstream called Congressman, and I loved it and tried to get. I think he again tried Jim Carrey, and nobody was home.
One of your proteges, one of your proteges became part of the Marvel universe, didn't he?
He sure did. Yes, indeedy.
James Gunn. Yeah. You want to talk a little bit about James and you, because you made a cameo in a Marvel movie.
Well, James wrote Romeo and Juliet, and which is one of Troma's more successful movies, and did a great job. And we worked together for I think 3 years, and then he fled to. I mean, he went to from Tromaville, New York, to Los Angeles, and kept working hard, and here he is today, the #1 director in City of Angels.
Very nice. Lloyd Kaufman, thank you for your time today. Enjoy your dinner, and I hope I'll get to talk to you soon.
Well, David, let's make sure that happens. Let's have a traumatic. And meanwhile, the Blue Apron Trophy housewife is back there. And if you want to see what she created, go to my Instagram story tonight, and you will see the magic of the trophy wife from Blue Apron Trophy wife.
The magic of live TV. Thank you, Lloyd. Okay, so there's Lloyd Kaufman is a character, and always fun to talk to. It's quite amazing.
Yeah, I'm looking up his Instagram now.
Yeah.
Since he brought it up.
I just want to let YouTube and everyone else know I am not getting any money for any of this. So, I have not made a penny. I would love to make a penny, certainly. I would love if Blue Apron would throw me some cash, but right now, no. So, just all free and clear. So we have a few more interviews to go through. Any thoughts after seeing Lloyd Kaufman do his thing?
Outside of needing a little Dramamine, no. Just to reiterate, what I probably said a few times already. the work, the body of the work, it wasn't just pop culture. It was a giant lesson in how to be, as far as I'm concerned, just in terms of being an artist, just in terms of the messages within the art, and I know for a fact my life would not be what it is without those messages, without those lessons, without the examples of loyalty and courage and all that other, truth, justice, and the American way type
Agreed,
talk.
Totally. Let's talk. You're good.
No, I was going to say, and it was also heartening to know that, this was a man who also really was big on standing up against racism.
Yeah.
And
early on.
Very early on. And the things he said about the creation of the X-Men and how Professor X and Magneto were sort of his play on Dr. King and Malcolm X and that business and just the way that he created the world around the mutants and how, despite how incredible they were, that they still had to go through persecution. It was, that in itself was also kind of heartening and uplifting in a sort of cathartic way, yes, but it was definitely there and it was definitely appreciated.
We are all our own best friends and worst enemies all at the same time.
Yes.
If we could see the world as a guy like Stan saw, and in his comic books, certainly the way he helped or showed, look, kids started reading those comic books and adults started reading the comics that he was writing.
Mm-hmm.
But the messages, again, as you pointed out, were messages that our parents wanted to give us. Without, it's like, you think about Bill Maher a couple of weeks ago, made some comments about Stan or about comics and the fact that, our entire society is dumbed down and we were celebrating this comic book guy and that's how we got Donald Trump. I'm paraphrasing very poorly. So apologies to Bill Maher for messing up. But tell me your thoughts and then I'll tell you mine on what Bill Maher said at the time.
I couldn't disagree with that more. And normally, Bill Maher is like, obviously I agree with him in terms of a lot of other things. I certainly would not blame comic book readers on Donald Trump or, you know what I mean? I wouldn't put that on us.
The fact that the perception is that comic book readers are, drooling idiots, children
right.
are, and,
no, that's a ridiculous generalization of, based on the fact that, he's just looking for something to make fun of, if you ask me.
Yeah.
I disagree with it. And frankly, it's because the thing I was pointing out the night before Thanksgiving, comics teach you right from wrong.
Yeah.
So you can't put that on comic book readers because we know right from wrong. There's no racist character in comic books that constantly wins or something like that. There's no,
or that isn't portrayed as evil. Right.
There's no charlatan superhero that bankrupts Atlantic City and and then goes on to be president. I mean, obviously Trump has Joker and Lex Luthor like qualities if you just want to sort of look at it that way.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm a little hard pressed to think of a Marvel character that
Kingpin?
Maybe.
Although the Kingpin is smart and in good shape, even though he's large, he's all muscle. So
right,
I don't think.
Yeah, so you can't even really, it's an insult to Kingpin.
Well, in other movies, you might compare him to, say, the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, for example.
Oh, there you go.
No, I don't want to get into politics, but I do want to. I did want to sort of address what Bill Maher said.
Right.
because
But Bill is wrong on that one.
well,
And
I think it displays an ignorance of comic books or what comic books are or what I mean, and it's fun. It's like if you like sports, there's a level of that same sort of feeling. There's soap opera and there's drama and there's excitement and there's great sort of cool science fiction concepts, but
exactly
at their core, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, at probably what you were about to say, like every aspect of pop culture, however you want to separate it, whether it's horror, science fiction, comic books, whatever, it's like all of that stuff works to different degrees as a morality play.
Yeah.
And even sports to some degree, professional wrestling, for example, that's a sort of a combination soap opera / display of athleticism.
Agreed.
And within that, again, a morality play, because America likes morality plays, which is one of the main things built into pop culture. Is like when you don't give a morality play, you almost fail to get people's attention.
Yeah.
To flip it over to the horror side for a second, it's funny because I was literally just watching Francis Ford Coppola's version of Dracula and just reminding myself that in the actual novel, there's not really a romance thing happening there, So the romance thing becomes part of the morality play to then make the movie more relatable. So for me, and I'm kind of running around in circles here a little bit, but
well, I think what we're going to do at some point, you and I should have a long conversation, because this is one of my areas that I've been fascinated about since college, is how the era influences the pop culture of that era.
Oh yes,
and we'll spend some time another time. But I want to get back to Stan now. We have a couple more people that we want to talk to, so I think we're going to move on to our next interview. So give me just a second, and I will find them. Joining me now is Danny Fingeroth, who was a editor at Marvel Comics and was editor of the Spider-Man books back in the day. He is a writer and is known very much for his articles and scholarly work on the world of comic books, and he is currently working on a biography of Stan Lee. Danny, welcome to the show.
Hey, David. Nice to be here.
Talk to me about Stan. You knew him a little bit, I guess, and worked with him. What was he like?
What am I looking at? Am I looking at me or you?
You just the way you're looking is fine.
Okay. So, ask me the question again.
Sure. Tell me a little bit about Stan. You worked with him a bit. What was he like?
I worked with him quite a number of times at Marvel and at other companies, including a place called Byron Price Multimedia and a company called Visionary Media and at Tomorrow's Publishing. But Stan in real life was kind of like the Stan you see in movies on TV, just a little quieter. He was, this sort of funny mix of this salesman but genuine. That was just his personality. He was bigger than life and very charismatic and very engaging. So he was fun to work with. He had kind of a classic sort of New York, Bronx sense of humor, always wisecracking, always with some kind of smart ass insult, which he didn't mean, and
kind of like Spider-Man.
Pretty much, somewhere like a cross between Spider-Man and Ben Grimm. I think that was part of what was the synergy between him and his artists like Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko. Because, as much as you can say character A is really more Jack and character B is more Steve, the fact is they were mixtures of the two of them, so that each creator imbued part of their personality. So when you say Peter Parker was Stan, yeah, and I think Peter Parker was part Steve, and I think Peter Parker was just this every kid. He probably had owed something to Dobie Gillis,
right?
And maybe even the kids, that Stan knew from around his neighborhood in Long Island.
Right, or the Archie comics. If you think about the trio between Archie and Betty and Veronica, and you got Peter and Gwen and Mary Jane, and then you've got Jughead and Harry Osborn, and you've got Reggie and Flash. I mean, it's almost like this parallel.
Well, don't forget that sort of what made Marvel Marvel and makes Marvel Marvel is that Stan was, the overnight sensation that took 20 years. He'd been editing and writing Millie the Model and teen romance comics and cowboy comics and science fiction comics and crime comics and fantasy comics and monster. So he was able to take smush all the different elements of all these different genres. And the superhero genre in general is an aggregate of a lot of different genres.
Right.
But Stan was so adept at writing and all of them that he brought aspects, to the offices of the Daily Bugle. There were aspects of the office of the modeling agency that Millie worked for. Mr. Hanover, her boss, sort of became part Jonah Jameson and part Stan himself. So he had so many years of experience and so much craft at his fingertips, like Ditko and Kirby and the other artists,
right,
too, that they could then mess around and experiment with what became the Marvel look and feel, because they knew how to do that stuff.
As you've been working on this biography, when is the biography supposed to be out? Is that in 2019?
Well, it's a little, definitely not 2018 anymore, since I'm still writing it. But yeah, I think we're looking at early or mid 2019. For the reasons that I think, now we sort of have an ending to the story. And although I think Stan's story will go on in various ways, his influence and the people he inspired. So we're looking at early/middle 2019. I think it's safe to say. That's more up to the the people at the publishing company who are wise in these things.
Right. What surprised you the most as you're researching this biography? And there's so much of Stan's life is kind of well known just through analysis and Stan himself, who's given both egotistical and self-deprecating, that interesting combination.
That was there from like text pieces in the comics where from the 40s and memos that I saw in the in Ohio State University at his agent's archives, letters and notes back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
So the guy we met in the early bullpen bulletins, the early letters pages, that person existed among his friends and colleagues, and to a certain degree in the comics. So it's not so much that he invented Stan Lee, but he found a way to share Stan Lee with the audience. So I guess that was kind of among the surprising things. And one thing that, that I've just always found interesting is what a compulsive truth teller he was. And I know people will go, truth teller? Stan was all about the hype. Well, if you know how to listen,
mm-hmm.
in between trying to sell you stuff, he would drop these truth bombs about himself or the business, or either say in interviews or on panels, or even read the letters pages of bullpen bulletins. There was way more information there than he needed for either a 12-year-old or even if you say, oh yeah, he was going for a college audience.
Right.
It was way more personal stuff. I think if only because in the days before computers, it was such a pain in the neck to delete and change anything, that I think a lot of what we saw was Stan's sort of first draft that only mildly edited and mildly redacted.
Stream of consciousness, yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a certain stream of consciousness to it. With the, I guess sort of the classic funniest one being, the announcement that Sal Brodsky had moved to a different apartment in the same building, was, because he would talk about, this guy moved to the suburbs and this guy moved to another city and Sal moved to a different apartment in the same building. And it may not be the world's funniest joke, and maybe if he had a word processing program, he might have rethought it. But it was like, it's funny enough, and and kind of charming enough that it gets left in. So I think that person you saw and that Stan who was your pal was I think a sincere thing. I don't think it was a big calculated. I think he looked at Marvel, as he said many times, as a big advertising campaign.
Right.
But I think what they were selling partly was sincerity and in a pre-internet way, a kind of relationship with the company, which in effect became, a relationship with Stan.
Community, a little bit of a community there. You felt like you were part of, especially early on, like everybody knows who Stan is, but 20 years ago, only a few, and 30 years ago, only the people who read the comic books, I would say. And Stan Lee's soapbox was an early blog, I would venture to say. It was his way of talking straight to us as the reader beyond... go ahead.
I think the whole bullpen bulletin was... I think it's starting with the letters page answers, moving to bullpen bulletins was was a blog. I think the soapbox was his attempt to kind of focus that on, selling stuff, but also giving some kind of philosophical point of view. So so I think you're right. There was a lot of blog quality to it. The soapbox, I think, might have been a little,
later on, it became much more hypey, but early on, it felt like...
It was hypey, and it varied. Really, I just think he was a guy with like 100 different deadlines. They were all due yesterday.
Yeah.
He had the gift of being able to get stuff done pretty well in a first draft.
Yeah.
And all that came, again, that comes from as I was saying, the overnight sensation that took 20 years. There was some 20 years of working in the editorial trenches there.
Right.
And, I think what he had and what a lot of successful media personalities have is as wealthy and famous as he would become. He did not lose touch with a certain core of what would mean something to the average person. I think maybe I was mentioning to you at some point that he lived in a very nice house in the Hollywood Hills, but the room that he worked in and did his writing in was as plain could be. It had paneling that probably was from 2 or 3 owners of the house before him.
Right.
In the days I remember being there when they had dot matrix printers that would spill out into a box. And it was literally like an old cardboard box that the stuff he was printing out would spill into. So I think he made it a point really to remember the kid who had been the poor kid growing up in Washington Heights in the Bronx.
Danny, perfect way to leave it. Thank you so much for joining me here today. It was great to see you.
Okay, thank you, David. And DannyFingeroth.com if anybody wants to know more fascinating information about me.
Perfect. We will send people there. Go there as soon as the show is over. Thank you, Danny, and we'll talk to you
You're
soon. Joining me now is Peter David. He is a writer and novelist and was one of my favorite writers when he was over at Marvel Comics. He's written more comics than I could even care to mention. He also worked on a graphic novel biography of Stan Lee. And thanks for coming today, Peter.
Happy to do it.
So talk to me, Peter, about Stan as you knew him, as you met him. When did you first meet Stan?
I met Stan for the first time on 5 different occasions. I was working as the assistant direct sales manager at Marvel Comics.
Uh-huh.
Oh, okay. I was working as the assistant direct sales manager at Marvel Comics. In those days, Stan would come out to the office every so often. He was based in Los Angeles.
Right.
But he would come out to New York every so often. And whenever I would run into him in the hallways, I would introduce myself because Stan's lousy memory was legendary.
Yes.
So I assumed from one occasion to the next that he wouldn't remember who I was. So I would always introduce myself, tell him my name, tell him what I did at the company, and he was always very polite. And the 5th time I ran into him in the hallway, I said, "Hey, Stan," and he said, "Hi, Peter," and I went, "Oh my God, Stan Lee remembers who I am." That's it.
That's a big deal.
I have now seriously arrived in comic books. Only took 5 different instances, but yeah.
Yeah, I think I met him for the first time about 7 times, so.
Yeah, Stan's memory wasn't the best. I remember there was a time when I was doing a Q&A with him, at a convention. I was the one who was handling the question. And Stan says to the audience, "Before we go ahead, I want to just let you guys know that this young man," he puts his arm on my shoulder, "wrote one of the greatest graphic novels I've ever read." And I immediately knew that I was in trouble because at that point in my career, I had not written any graphic novel. And I know whatever he's going to say is not going to go well. And he says, "Greenberg the Vampire." And what was great was the audience's reaction because they go like this. Wait, what? What did it take? And I'm sitting there like this. And I said, "Should I tell him?" And the audience is kind of going, "You're probably going to have to." And Stan says, "Tell me what?" And I said, "Yeah, Greenberg the Vampire was written by Mark DeMatteis." He said, "It was?" "Yes." "Well, what have you written?" Right. I mean, but I didn't take it personally because his memory of himself wasn't much better. There was a time I was out in Los Angeles and Stan and I were going out to lunch, which I say that, and to this day I'm still kind of impressed. Stan Lee and I were going out to lunch.
Right.
And he was driving this kind of open-top Jeep, and we were discussing what I was doing in the Hulk at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Well, I've actually restored him to what you guys did in the very first issue, which is that he changes at night into the Hulk."
Mm-hmm.
And Stan says, "No, he changes when he gets angry." I said, "Not originally. In the first issue, he was like a werewolf. He changed at night." And Stan says, "He did?" I went, "Yeah." He says, "I wonder why we changed it." And he thinks about it for a moment, and he says, "It was probably Jack's idea." I'm like, okay.
That's so funny.
I mean, nobody remembers that.
Even then,
Stan didn't remember that. Jack Kirby didn't remember that. Jack did an interview in Comic Buyers in the Comics Journal,
mm-hmm.
in which he talked about how he single-handedly created the Hulk. And he says he got the idea from a news story that detailed a frantic mother whose child was trapped under a car. And she became so alarmed and so freaked out that she gave the string to lift the car. And and that occurred to him. What would happen if a monster, if a guy was able to, by when he got angry and upset, was able to transfer into a monster? And I'm thinking, that's very nice. And indeed, that's what Bruce Banner was able to do several years later. But in the original, rage had absolutely nothing to do with it.
Right.
So it was like nobody seemed to remember.
It took fans like us. Of course, he's also famously the guy who called Peter Parker Peter Palmer, and Bruce Banner Bob Banner.
Bob Banner. Well, Peter Palmer they just kind of ignored.
Yeah.
Bob Banner was likewise a one-time thing, but they felt the need to explain that, and so he became Robert Bruce Banner. Okay, fine, whatever.
I interviewed Stan, and I'll show this. I may show this clip a little bit later, where he talks about how the network changed his name yet again to David. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that was weird. I mean, at the time, the name Bruce, for some bizarre reason, was considered a kind of effete, feminine name.
I think it was because of Monty Python. This would be my best guess. Hello, really? Bruce. Yeah, Bruce. There was a lot of that going on.
Well, whatever. For a time, it was associated with gayness or I don't know what the hell. And so apparently he could not be Bruce Banner. But why the hell didn't they just call him Bob Banner?
Right.
At least that's consistent with the comic.
Right.
But they weren't really worried about consistency with the comics.
No, and honestly, I don't think that anybody would have ever wondered about the Hulk's orientation at that point.
Well, hey, at one point I was on an airplane and I was sitting next to this woman, and we got to talking, and I told her that I wrote The Incredible Hulk, and she looked very surprised, and she said, "I thought the Hulk was dead." And I said, "What?" And she said, "No, there was a TV movie, The Death of the Incredible Hulk, in which the Hulk fell off of a helicopter and died from the impact." And I said to her, "You need to understand that in the comic books, the Hulk could fall from orbit, and he would hit the ground, and there'd be a crater, and the Hulk would get up and dust and brush the dust off his shoulders and go on his way. A fall from a helicopter would not kill the Hulk."
So to get back to Stan, that's really funny. To get back to Stan, and you worked on that graphic novel, which I have, and it was wonderful. What led to that? What inspired that? How did that come about?
Stan had a literary agent who came up with the idea, and she managed to sell Simon & Schuster on. Then she came to me to write it. I don't know whether she knew my name independently or whether Stan was the one who recommended me. Either way, I was brought on to be the writer. And she asked me if I had any suggestions for the artist. And I immediately came up with Colleen Durant, who did a marvelous job with that graphic novel under really very difficult circumstances, because the deadline, the deadline was insanely tight, and Stan and his people kept making changes to the script. So, poor Colleen was drawing stuff and had to toss it, redraw it. She was going out of her mind, but you can't tell when you read it because it looks terrific.
Right. Wow. So what do you take away from that? I mean, you've worked with him, you've met him, you've been introduced to him multiple times, you've been on panels with him.
Yeah.
What's Peter David's take on Stan Lee and his legacy?
We're living out his legacy. I mean, if Stan had not been inspired by Joni to create the Fantastic Four,
his wife, right,
launched the Marvel Age of Comics, first off, there would not have been a Marvel Comics for Disney to purchase. There would not have been movies generating billions upon billions of dollars. And Neil Gaiman once said that when you take pictures by themselves, that's artwork and the province of the adult.
Mhm.
If you have words by themselves, that's literature and the province of the adult. But for some reason, when you combine words and pictures, people immediately think of that as kid stuff.
Right.
Except it's really not true. If you look at the top 50 movies that have ever been made, 48 of them are science fiction, fantasy, or comic book. Exactly. And when Stan was launching the Marvel Age of comic books, the comics were huge at universities.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Stan crisscrossed his country, going to dozens upon dozens of universities and doing Q&As with the students. And indeed, I even wrote about that in the graphic novel, in which
Right.
I depicted visually his stories about how whenever he would go out into the world of the universities, it was a constant series of Q&As from the moment that they picked him up at the airport until the moment they drove him back to the airport. Whatever you will say about Stan, whatever he did or did not do in the creation of the characters, he nevertheless created the Marvel Age of comics, both in his contributions to the character,
Yeah,
and to the mindset that comic books could be of interest to more than just kids. I mean, if you look at kids nowadays, most kids don't read comics. Indeed, I was at a playground with my daughter, who at the time was about 3 or 4 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw various kids wearing Spider-Man jackets, Spider-Man t-shirts, Captain America sneakers, all these Marvel tchotchkes. And I would go up to the kids because, of course, you're a middle-aged man in a going to want to go up and start talking to kids randomly. And I would walk up to the kids and I would ask them or their parents if the kids read the comic books.
Mm-hmm.
Uniformly, no. They played video games. They watched the animated series. God knows they loved the movies and they watched the DVDs.
Right.
They were never the slightest bit interested in reading comic books. When I was their age, comic books were the only venues in which you could follow the adventure of these characters. Now there's dozens of different places where you can experience them, and you can even participate in them. So the fact that Stan helped drive comic books to a wider audience
Mm-hmm.
has enabled comic books to live and thrive to this day, even if they're just being supported by kids wearing their tchotchkes.
It's interesting. I think about when we grew up, and that puts us both in the old man category, I guess. But
Oh, you've got grayer hair than I did.
and not as much as I used to either.
Here,
But I thought, I even thought about this when I was a kid. I mean, we didn't have DVDs, and we didn't have on demand, and we didn't have VHS, and we didn't have iPads and phones and all that kind of stuff. And so, if a TV show wasn't on the air, like for us, it was Superman or Batman.
Yeah,
you could read a comic book, and Superman and Batman.
Think about this. At the end of every episode of the George Reeves Superman series, the announcer's voice always said, "Superman is based on the character appearing in Superman magazine."
Right.
That was the first time I found out the comic book existed.
Right.
I go, there are magazines of Superman? That sounded great. Magazines were, comic books were our DVD.
Correct.
It meant that I did not have to wait until 4:30 in the afternoon every day to watch Superman. If I wanted to experience a Superman adventure, I could buy a comic and I could read the comic, and I could reread the comic anytime that I wanted to.
And they were in color. TV, for most of us, was in black and white at that point. So here, this is in color, so that was so much better, than the TV.
The first TV program I ever saw in color, Superman.
Really?
It was on the TV at, I think it was the World's Fair. The
wow.
World's Fair place called the Home of the Future, which we would now call the home of, like, the late 1960s. And you went into this home, and I don't remember anything else about the Home of the Future.
Except to color TV.
Except that it had a color television, which I had never seen in my life, and Superman was on.
Awesome. My first color TV show I saw was I Dream of Jeannie, and I was so happy that she was pink. And then the second one, when we bought a color TV, we turned on the TV, and it was Star Trek, and that was like, wait, different colors?
Oh, yeah.
So, well, Peter, final thoughts on Stan before we go, and I'd love to get you on another time just for you for an hour, because I could just talk to you forever.
Oh, God.
Final thoughts on Stan? Something,
The first Marvel comic I ever read, the first Marvel comic I ever read, I read at my cousin's house. He had a stack of comic books, and he had Fantastic Four Annual number 3, the issue where Reed and Sue get married. And I sat down and I read the comic. Now, keep in mind, I didn't know who any of the Marvel characters were. Right. I had no introduction to the Marvel Universe. I didn't know who the FF were. I didn't know who Spider-Man was. I didn't know who Doctor Doom was. And yet I sat there and I read that issue, and I understood everything.
Yes.
I mean, they always say that every comic is somebody's first issue. Fantastic Four Annual number 3 was my first issue of a Marvel comic. And despite the fact that I had zero familiarity with the Marvel Universe, I understood every single thing.
Yeah.
That happened in that issue.
Yeah.
Because the one thing I did not understand was the bit at the end where two guys with top hats are refused entry into their wedding. A scene that was actually repeated in Fantastic Four: The Rise of the Silver Surfer.
Correct.
Where Stan showed up and they wouldn't let him into the wedding, even though he was going, I'm Stan Lee.
Right.
We don't know, dude. I mean, if you really want to go into continuity, you should say, oh, it's Willie Lumpkin. Come on in. But no. At any rate, the fact that Stan was a capable enough writer to be able to produce that comic book was just, amazing, fantastic, incredible. that he could produce a comic that someone with zero familiarity of the Marvel Universe was able to read.
Yes.
And it didn't register on me at the moment, but many, many, many years later, I'm sitting there at the table where we are plotting out the 2099 universe. And I'm sitting there next to Stan because he was going to be doing a book called Ravage.
Right.
And I'm sitting there next to Stan, and I'm thinking to myself, wow, how far have I come that I'm sitting here and collaborating with the guy who wrote the first Marvel comic I ever wrote. I mean, Stan was just absolutely, a fantastic guy. I didn't see him enough to say that he was something of a mentor, but his characters certainly spoke.
Yeah, to all of us, I think. To all of us. Just you. It was just you, Peter. Which is why nobody else remembers him except for you. Yes, we are entering the Peter David age of I don't know what, the universe.
Okay, works for me.
Peter, it is such a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Happy to do it.
Joining us now is Paul Levitz, who was the former publisher at DC Comics and a writer and a scholar of comic book history, who knew Stan and worked with Stan a bunch, and but not too much, not as much as some of the Marvel guys, because you were a DC guy. But Paul, let's talk about your memories of Stan. You knew him a little bit, and you worked with him a couple of times. Tell me, what was your experience with Stan Lee?
I got to know Stan well into my career because, as you say, I was a DC guy. I started on that side of the fence. So unlike a very high proportion of my friends of my generation, I never had the chance to learn from him hands-on. Marvel went through 6 or 7 editors-in-chief in a row and a bunch of other interesting young people as assistant editors, all of whom got to have Stan show them how to design a cover or how to place word balloons. And I mostly got those lessons secondhand from them early on in my career. We came into contact for the first time back in the 80s when I got a note from him complimenting me on a DC bullpen page that I had done as an obit for Saul Harrison.
Oh, wow.
Production guy who was the head of DC for a few years. And a compliment from Stan was cool, but a compliment on a bullpen page?
Yes.
How much better does it get than that? And over the years from there, we had more opportunities for me to be in contact and eventually became friends and would grab a dinner occasionally when I was in LA or run into each other on a plane for a conversation.
What was he like? What was Stan like?
Most of the time, he was like the Stan Lee that you see. Energizer bunny, full of energy. You couldn't go to a restaurant with him without his charming the waitress, not with any intent of actually doing anything, but just charming her because he had to charm everyone around him. Once in a very long while, we'd end up in a meal or a situation where he'd kind of have the avatar off and be calm for a while, and you'd see something about the inner Stan in the process, not the perfectly polished Stan.
Right. He's still human. You got to turn off that character that he created sometime.
I would think so. I mean, there were a couple of occasions when I was out to dinner with him and his wife Joan. She was pretty good at turning off the avatar pretty quickly.
He couldn't do it 24/7, and certainly not at home with his wife.
Yeah, I think he might have been able to do it 24/7 by that point in life, but she just wasn't buying any of it.
That's awesome. She knew him. I knew you when, Stan. What was it like? How did he came over to DC Comics very briefly, didn't he? I spoke to Mike Gooslin, and he had a really good story about that. What was your side of the story when Stan ended up doing Just Imagine Stan at DC Comics?
It was a fun idea. It was unlikely to create something that would be a lasting intellectual property. But I think everyone was curious to see what would happen. A lot of the artists who had never had a chance to work with him were thrilled at the opportunity to do it. And it was interesting to see his alternative way of thinking about those puzzles a little bit. What are the elements that make Superman Superman? How do I sort that a little bit differently?
Right.
I also had the fun of working with him on a story he did for us for our 9/11 book that I edited.
Tell me about that a little bit.
Everybody in the world wanted to be supportive of the 9/11 thing and had volunteered. And, oh my God, Stan's willing to do a story? I can, quote unquote, edit Stan Lee? How ridiculous is that? And Marie Severin drew it, so I got a chance to work with her for the only time in my career.
Right.
Just delighted my inner 12-year-old, and was a lot of fun for the grown-up me as well.
What do you think Stan's lasting legacy is for comic books, for the creative world in general? What do you think he's left us?
Well, I think there's very separate legacies for the different areas. For comics, he was unquestionably the best promoter the comic book business ever saw. And both for what he did to create Marvel as a true brand that's one of the most powerful brands in the world, and I think after Disney, probably, or maybe after Disney, maybe the most powerful entertainment brand. It's a stronger brand than Pixar, certainly, and that might be the next runner-up. For the world in general, I think you really have to credit Stan with developing the idea of the interlocking universe of different creative properties.
Yeah.
Disney used multiple properties and things like Disneyland long before Stan developed it, but they never really successfully made the properties fit creatively. When you go through the Toontown areas or things like that, there's a Mickey house, there's a Donald house, but they don't make any sense together. There's no effective way of bridging it. It's just, oh, okay, these are where the cartoons are. This is where the little kitty stuff is. Now I can walk over to the Cinderella castle. Okay. Fine, I've got a map.
Right.
What Stan did with the crossovers, with the way the different characters represented aspects of the different ways you look at the same puzzle, the same factor in life, really became the model, not just for comics, but for the video game world, for the television world, and for the movie world, even way beyond the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It really is a cultural touchstone. You have a handful of writers, science fiction writers that I'm familiar with, certainly, who had stories of different characters that fit together. I think it was Heinlein called his The Future History.
Right.
But they didn't move back and forth through each other's worlds. It wasn't truly a coherent world. It wasn't a true fictional universe in most cases. Or if it was for a half dozen stories, and if you really loved their material, you might know it. You might be able to piece together how Asimov's robots had something to do with the time of the Foundation, but you really had to know what you were doing to have that as a part of a conversation.
The nearest thing I can think of is, and also tilt your phone.
Sorry.
Yeah, there you go, buddy. The nearest thing I can think of is Castle Rock and Stephen King's series of novels, which all sort of like would allude to the events of the other ones in sort of novel form.
But Stephen King's a comic book fan.
Yes,
he was writing for the fanzines, reading Stan's stuff.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm not taking anything away from King. I'm just saying that
Stan did it first.
By 1963, 1964, Stan's really got this act down pat.
Right.
And I don't think I'm not a scholar of it. It's possible somebody can identify something that I've missed, but I don't think you can find anyone doing it on that kind of scale till well after Stan's made a great example of it.
I also think that there were a lot of happy accidents. You know, you had pointed out when we talked about Jack Kirby, these guys were just running as fast as they could to meet their deadlines and get the comics out and get the stories told and all that. And they would make mistakes sometimes, and sometimes those mistakes would lead to later writers sort of finding teasing out these little elements and going, oh, you know what?
Absolutely.
This can relate to that.
You know, Jack in particular was such a fertile imagination. He threw off ideas like a dog throws off water when it comes in. Right? And some of them were relevant to the stories. Some made perfect sense. Some Stan was able to make sense out of that might or might not have quite pulled together in and of themselves. But it was really rich, developed work. So there was lots of possibility for people to build on all of it.
Yes. Yeah. And lots of little details that could be found later and built into entire, there'd be one little alien somewhere in an Avengers comic, and then decades later there'd be this whole huge thing.
What happened to the last of the Skrulls?
That's right.
Exactly. For that story.
That's right. Any other stories that you can share with us before we go, Paul?
I mean, there's bunches of stories, but they all really come down to his being a guy who had developed this avatar, was very conscious of it, was very comfortable in his self-deprecating. He understood that he had somehow won the lottery in life, that there was just a decade when we couldn't do anything wrong, as he put it.
Yeah.
And he was having a great time with all of it.
He did.
It's wonderful.
He did. I've more than once the last couple of weeks I've referred to him as the world's most accessible icon. I
think that could be fair.
Yeah, there have been a lot of icons in entertainment and pop culture, but he reached out and he made you feel like you knew him, in a way that Uncle Walt never did.
Well, part of it is the time he came of age, obviously. Yeah. But it was very much who he was. I'll give you one short story just for the fun of it. It's got to be 15 years ago, maybe. The Atlantic magazine came out with an issue of the most influential Americans in history, one of those things where you poll the great historians. And they had a little sidebar of the most influential living Americans. I'm a bit of a history buff, so I picked it up off the newsstand. It was an intriguing title. I started reading it, and Stan's in the list of most influential living Americans.
Amazing.
Well, I don't know whether Stan reads The Atlantic every month. I don't. His politics are probably a little further left even than mine, if there is any room left on the left. But still, you don't know who reads what. So I shoot him a fast email. He's already in his late 80s. A few minutes go by, I get back an email in perfect Stan Lee. Thank you so much for the message. I hope I don't run anybody over on the way down to the newsstand. I'm so excited. It goes on for a few paragraphs like this. A couple hours go by. The email dings again. It's Stan. Paul, I thought you knew me. First of all, they only give me one paragraph. And then they list me below Bill Clinton. And it goes on like this for about another few lines. The playfulness in that, of the self-awareness of the image he's created for himself, the comfort with the self-deprecating humor to toss to a friend and something like that, and the goddamn energy level to do that in your late 80s. Yeah,
it's amazing. It's amazing. Paul, thank you so much for coming on and chatting with us and sharing your thoughts about Stan.
My pleasure, David. Take care of yourself.
Talk to you soon.
Bye.
How's that, Steve? Can you hear me now?
Hey, there you are.
There I am. Okay, so I just was saying that they have just dropped a new Captain Marvel trailer on Monday Night Football. So you should definitely check out that. But we're going to wrap this up. Steve, thanks for dropping by to sort of keep me company.
Sure, thanks for having.
Any final thoughts on Stan before we go? We seem to have wrung it out, but this is the longest show we've ever done,
and rightfully so. I mean, as you said, we lost our accessible icon. So, it's unfortunate, but it's definitely a life well lived and one that we should all hope to somehow emulate.
Oh my God! And he lived it all the way to the end, didn't he? He never stopped creating.
Nope.
Which is not just a lesson to us as creators, but a lesson to those people out there who should be looking to start whenever you want to start. It's never too late. He did not start the Marvel age until he was in his 40s. You think about that, which is
how about that?
Pretty outstanding. So, just do it. Just get out there and do it.
Absolutely.
Do something new. Want to thank my guests tonight, Paul Levitz, Danny Fingeroth, Peter David, Ari Kaplan, Larry Lieberman. Did I miss anybody? I don't know. I'd probably... And a couple of people we had scheduled to come on. We weren't able to get them for tonight, but we will be getting them soon. And we will do, I guess, a part 2 of this. So thank you all very much, and we will see you soon.
Ouch. Ooh.